In this video, we're breaking down the Witcher schools: Wolf, Bear, Griffin, Viper, and Cat. What makes each one unique, how they train their witches, and the lore behind them. This video will remain calm, perfect for studying, sleeping, or just winding down. If you're new here, subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps. In the 10th century, the continent was a different place, overrun by the monsters left behind after the conjunction of the spheres. The mage Alzur and his mentor, Cosimo Malaspina, decided the world needed professional protectors to thin out these populations. They weren't looking for heroes. They were looking for tools that could survive the things humans couldn't. To get there, they used a combination of mutagens, toxic herbs, and sorcery to rewrite human biology from the inside out. It was a desperate solution to a desperate problem that the traditional armies of the northern kingdoms weren't equipped to handle. It wasn't a clean process by any stretch of the imagination. The early trials were catastrophic, and the mortality rate sat somewhere around 90%. Before they stabilized the process into what we now call the trial of the grasses, the experiments produced failures known as aggregates. These children didn't become witches. They became broken, twisted things that didn't survive the transition. Alzur eventually found a way to make the mutations stick, but the cost in lives was the foundation the entire profession was built on. And most children simply didn't survive the alchemical flooding of their systems. The process was designed to strip away human weakness and replace it with something faster and more durable. The mutagens reshaped the nervous system, granted enhanced senses, and opened a capacity for the signs that went beyond any natural human limit. Alzur and Cosimo weren't just making soldiers. They were crafting a new species of predator. They needed something that could track a necrophage in the dark and react to a strike before a human eye could even register the movement. The mutation was the price of entry into a world of shadows that most people preferred to ignore. Alzur's role in this was both as a creator and a catalyst for the chaos that followed. He was a man of immense power and questionable ethics, she willing to break as many lives as necessary to achieve his results. The early witches were effectively his property, subjects in a grand experiment to see if magic could force evolution to happen in a single generation. He didn't care about the trauma he inflicted. He only cared about the effectiveness of the final product. This cold, detached approach to creation set a tone for the Witcher life that would persist for centuries. The survival of the first few stabilized witches was a turning point for the continent. For the first time, humanity had a weapon that could strike back against the drowners in the rivers and the ghouls in the graveyards. These men were the proof that Alzur's theories were correct, even if they were built on a mountain of small graves. They were the first to walk the path, carrying the mutations that would eventually be refined and passed down through the schools. But at this stage, there were no schools, only a small group of mutants trying to figure out what they were. The legacy of these early experiments is a bitter one. Even after the process was refined, the trial of the grasses remained a brutal, life-threatening ordeal that left survivors fundamentally changed. The witches never forgot that their existence was the result of a mage's ambition and a child's suffering. It's why the relationship between witches and mages has always been one of mutual suspicion and underlying resentment. They were created by sorcery, but they were never quite accepted by the men who wielded it. Before the schools split off into their own separate paths, there was just the Order. They were stationed at Morgraig Castle, a fortress hidden in the Kestrel Mountains. It functioned as a hybrid between a military unit and a monastic order. The atmosphere was one of rigid discipline and shared purpose, a place where the first generation of witchers could learn what it meant to be a protector. It was the only time in history when every witcher on the continent followed the same rules and answered to the same masters. At Morgraig, mages handled the alchemical side and taught the basics of the signs, while knights were brought in to teach the boys how to handle a sword. It was a structured environment designed to produce a very specific kind of warrior who was as comfortable with a blade as he was with a basic spell. This combination of disciplines was unique to the Order, blending the physical prowess of a knight with the utility of minor sorcery. They weren't just killing machines. They were students of a new craft that required both mental and physical fortitude. This first generation of witchers was surprisingly idealistic compared to what came later. They were bound by a strict code that forbid them from taking contracts against humans. They saw themselves as a pan-continental police force that existed only to protect people from the supernatural. The idea was to keep the silver sword for monsters and never let the steel sword be drawn for coin or politics. It was a philosophy of service that was meant to give the mutants a place in a society that already feared them. The Order was supposed to be a neutral entity, standing apart from the squabbles of kings and the ambitions of empires. By focusing strictly on the monster threat, they hoped to be seen as a necessary good rather than a political threat. They traveled the continent as a unified group, and for a while, the medallion of the Order was a respected symbol. It represented a commitment to the safety of all people, regardless of which flag they happened to live under. It was the closest the witchers ever came to having a true homeland. However, even in these early days, the seeds of division were being sown. The mages who resided at Morgraig still viewed the witchers as their creations rather than their peers. They controlled the supply of mutagens and the secrets of the trials, keeping the witchers on a short leash. This power dynamic created a simmering tension within the castle walls. The witchers were doing the dangerous work on the path, but the mages were the ones making the decisions and reaping the political benefits of a monster-free landscape. As the number of witchers grew, so did their sense of identity. They were starting to realize that they didn't necessarily need the mages to tell them how to live their lives. The camaraderie formed on the training grounds of Morgraig was stronger than any loyalty to the sorcerers who had broken them to make them. They were becoming a brotherhood, and that brotherhood was starting to push back against the restrictions of the Order. The dream of a unified, knightly organization was slowly being replaced by a desire for independence. The unity of the Order didn't last because the people running it couldn't agree on what a witcher should be. The mages who created the process wanted to maintain total control over their creations, while the witchers were starting to realize they didn't need masters. The idealistic code of the knight-errant was starting to feel like a cage to those who saw how the world actually worked. Tensions were already high when a massive warrior named Arnaghad murdered a fellow witcher during a dispute. This event wasn't just a simple fight. It was a sign that the shared code was starting to rot from the inside. Arnaghad was a man who believed in strength and results over the niceties of a knightly code. When he drew blood against one of his own brothers, he shattered the illusion of the Order's moral superiority. It proved that the mutations hadn't just taken their humanity, It had given them the capacity for a different kind of violence that the Order wasn't equipped to contain. The fallout was immediate and devastating for the institution's future. This event triggered what's known as the First Fracture. The internal schism was bloody and final, leaving the Order's idealism in pieces. Disillusioned members began to abandon Morgraig Castle, taking their equipment and their mutation formulas with them. They didn't just leave, they left to form specialized schools based on their own ideas about survival and the role of a mutant in a human world. The dream of a unified force died that day, replaced by a series of competing philosophies that would eventually lead to the different Witcher schools. The mages at Morgraig were unable to stop the exodus. Without the Witchers to protect them and do the work, the castle became a hollow shell of its former self. The sorcerers were left with the records and the laboratories, but the soul of the movement had walked out the gate with the men they had created. The fracture was a turning point for the continent, as it meant that there would no longer be a single authority to hold witchers accountable to a universal code. From this point on, every school would make its own rules. Pride played as much of a role in the collapse as violence did. Every senior witcher who left Morgraig believed that his way was the better way. They were tired of being treated like weapons by mages and wanted to be masters of their own destiny. This desire for autonomy led to the formation of the first splinter groups, each one moving to a different corner of the continent to start over. They were searching for a place where they could define themselves on their own terms, free from the shadow of Alzur's original vision. The collapse of the Order was the end of the golden age of Witcher unity. It marked the transition from a cohesive organization to a fragmented collection of schools that often looked upon each other with suspicion or outright hostility. While this allowed for a greater variety of combat styles and specializations, it also made the Witchers more vulnerable to the political winds of the north and south. They were no longer a single, untouchable entity, but a series of smaller targets for a world that was slowly turning against them. The Bears were the first significant group to break away from the Order after the fracture. They were men who had seen enough of the Mage's control and the Knight's empty promises. They moved south to Hayan Kaduch, a fortress carved into the unforgiving peaks of the Amel Mountains. They abandoned the knight-errant idealism of the original Order for a cold, individualistic pragmatism. To a Bear Witcher, the world wasn't something to be saved. It was a place where only the strongest survived. They prioritized heavy armor and raw physical endurance over the agility and signs favored by other schools. A Bear Witcher was built to take a hit and keep moving, relying on their sheer toughness to outlast a monster in a war of attrition. They viewed themselves as solitary mountain predators rather than community servants. This philosophy was reflected in their equipment, which was often thick, fur-lined, and designed to withstand both a monster's claws and the biting cold of their mountain home. Socially, the Bears were the most isolated of all the Witcher schools. They didn't care for the camaraderie of the wolves or the scholarly pursuits of the Griffins. They were men of few words, preferring the silence of the mountains to the noise of human villages. This reputation for being cold and unapproachable didn't help their standing with the common folk, who often found them as frightening as the monsters they were hired to kill. They were the outsiders among outsiders, and they liked it that way. Arnaghad's influence on the school was total. He was a man who led by example, and his example was one of brutal efficiency. He didn't want his students to be heroes. He wanted them to be survivors. This meant stripping away any lingering sentimentality about the Witcher's role in society. A contract was a transaction, nothing more. If the coin was good, the monster died. If not, the bear moved on, leaving the village to its fate without a second thought. This cold pragmatism extended to how they viewed their own brothers. While other schools maintained a sense of family, the bears were much more individualistic. Once a student passed their trials, they were expected to stand on their own 2 feet. There were no winter gatherings at Herne Caduce for long-winded stories or shared meals. A bear witcher was alone from the moment he walked out the gate, and he expected the same from everyone else he met on the road. The School of the Bear represented the first major shift away from the original purpose of the Witchers. By focusing on the self rather than the collective, they set a precedent for the specialized, often mercenary nature that would define many of the schools in the centuries to come. They were the first to prove that a Witcher could survive without the Order, but they also proved that such survival often came at the cost of the very humanity they were supposed to be protecting. The Bears didn't believe in making things easy for their recruits, and their specific trial was a testament to that belief. It involved a naked trek up Mount Gorgon in the middle of winter, a feat that would kill a normal man in minutes. Those who didn't freeze to death or fall into a crevasse were considered tempered, having proven that their mutations were strong enough to withstand the most extreme environments. It was a brutal way to filter out the weak, ensuring that every bear witcher was as hard as the stone they lived in. Surviving this rite of passage was meant to prove more than just physical endurance. It was a test of the mind. To keep walking through a blizzard without clothes required a level of stoicism that most people couldn't comprehend. This fostered a culture of extreme emotional detachment. Bear witchers often lacked the social graces of wolves or griffins, frequently refusing to speak to clients beyond negotiating a fee. They weren't being rude. They simply didn't see the point in wasting breath on words that didn't change the outcome of a hunt. Their way of life was one of total self-reliance. In the Amel Mountains, there was no one to call for help and no safety net if you made a mistake. You either did the job right or you died in the snow. This environmental pressure produced a breed of witcher that was exceptionally skilled at solo hunting in the most dangerous terrain on the continent. They were the ones you called when a monster had taken up residence in a place where no one else dared to go. The lack of fraternal bonds was a deliberate choice by the school's instructors. They believed that a witcher who relied on others was a witcher who would eventually be let down. By forcing their students to be solitary from the start, they ensured that every graduate was a complete unit in himself. This made them excellent individual contractors, but it also meant that the school as a whole was less than the sum of its parts. There was no collective strength to draw on when things went wrong. This stoicism often made them appear more like the monsters they hunted than the humans they served. A man who can walk through a frozen mountain naked isn't someone that a common peasant can relate to. This created a profound wall of misunderstanding between the bears and the rest of the world. They were seen as freakish and unfeeling, an image they did nothing to dispel. To a bear, the opinion of a human was as irrelevant as the wind on the mountain peaks. Despite their coldness, there was a certain integrity to the bears' way of life. They didn't lie, they didn't play politics, and they didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. They were the ultimate professionals in a world that was becoming increasingly messy and compromised. They lived by a very simple set of rules. Survive, do the work, and stay out of the way. It was a lonely existence, but for the bears, it was the only one that made any sense. The end of the School of the Bear wasn't a grand and cinematic battle, but something much more pathetic. It began with a failed contract involving a high-ranking vampire cabal that had taken root in the region. The bears, despite their strength, were unable to fully uproot the threat, and the fallout was disastrous for the surrounding villages. The local Skelligers, a people who valued strength above all else, felt betrayed by the very mutants they had relied on for protection. The failed contract gave the local population an excuse to vent their long-standing resentment toward the school. They blamed the witches for bringing more trouble than they solved, claiming that the presence of Arnaghad was what drew the monsters to the area in the first place. It was a classic case of a community turning on its protectors once the danger became too great to ignore. The tension quickly escalated into a full-blown peasant riot, with angry mobs marching on the keep. What happened next was perhaps the most surprising thing about the bears. Rather than slaughtering the angry peasants, which they were more than capable of doing, the witches simply chose to walk away. They didn't fight for their home, and they didn't try to explain themselves. They watched as the mobs set fire to the outbuildings and looted the lower levels. Then they gathered their things and vanished into the mountains. They abandoned Arnaghad to the snow and the fire without a single drop of human blood on their swords. This decision said more about who the bears were than any of their combat feats. Despite their reputation for coldness and lack of social graces, they still held to a fundamental piece of the Witcher identity. They were not there to kill humans. Even when those humans were trying to destroy them, the bears refused to become the monsters the world claimed they were. They chose to let their legacy die, rather than preserve it through a massacre of the people they were meant to protect. The abandonment of the keep was the final act of the School of the Bear. Without a central location to train new recruits or store their knowledge, the remaining witches were scattered to the winds. They continued to work the path as individuals, but the school as an institution was gone. The records of their heavy armor techniques and their mountain survival skills were lost to the elements or destroyed by the looters. It was a quiet, dignified end for a school that had always preferred silence. Yet in the end, the bears were victims of the very pragmatism they preached. They saw that their time was over and that the world no longer had a place for them in the Amel Mountains. Rather than clinging to a ruined fortress, they chose to accept the reality of their situation and move on. It was the ultimate expression of their philosophy: adapt to the environment or perish. The bears chose to perish as a school so that they could continue to exist as men, however briefly. The School of the Viper has one of the darkest origins of all the Witcher traditions. Born out of a failed coup and a twisted vision, Ivar Evil Eye was a senior Witcher in the School of the Bear who experienced a unique mutation glitch during his transformation. It gave him a permanent physical deformity, one eye that seemed to stare into a different world. But it also gave him a gift. He could see into the dimension of the wild hunt, catching glimpses of the spectral riders that everyone else believed were just ghosts. This vision consumed him. Ivar became obsessed with the idea that the witches were wasting their time on drowners and ghouls, while a much greater threat was lurking in the spaces between worlds. He tried to convince Arnaghad to pivot the Bear School's focus towards studying and fighting the hunt. But the bear leader had no interest in chasing shadows. The disagreement eventually turned violent, and Ivar led a group of like-minded followers in an attempt to seize control of Herne Caduch. The coup failed, and Ivar and his group were forced to flee into the Tir Tochar Mountains on the edge of the Nilfgaardian Empire. There, in a fortress called Gorthur Gvaed, they founded the School of the Viper. They weren't just monster hunters anymore. They were a secret society dedicated to gathering information on the spectres of Merhug, which we now know as the Wild Hunt. Every aspect of their training was redesigned to prepare them for a war that most of the world didn't even know was happening. The betrayal that created the Vipers permanently stained their reputation with the other schools. To the wolves and griffins, the Vipers were traitors who had turned on their own kind for the sake of a madman's vision. This isolation only pushed the Vipers further into the shadows. They became secretive and insular, developing their own unique methods of combat and alchemy that were unknown to the rest of the Witcher community. They were the black sheep of the profession, and they leaned into that role with a grim intensity. Ivar's vision of the hunt wasn't just an obsession, it was the entire foundation of the Viper philosophy. They believed that the only way to defeat a spectral enemy was to become like them, invisible, fast, and lethal. This led to a focus on stealth and the use of twin short blades, a radical departure from the standard longswords used by other schools. They wanted to be able to strike and vanish before the riders of the hunt could even register their presence. The Vipers were the first school to realize that the world was much larger and more dangerous than a few stray monsters. By looking beyond the continent's borders, they gained a perspective that the other schools lacked, but it came at a high cost. They lived a life of constant paranoia, always looking at the sky for signs of the purple bruised clouds that signaled the hunt's arrival. They were the only ones who knew the truth, and that truth made them the most dangerous and desperate witchers on the continent. The training within Gorthur Gvaed was designed to produce a witcher who was more of a ghost than a soldier. While the wolf or griffin schools focused on the honorable confrontation, the Vipers specialized in the art of the ambush. They were the masters of Macaris, specialized short swords that allowed for rapid, fluid strikes in tight spaces, where a traditional longsword would be a liability. This preference for shorter steel wasn't just a combat choice. It was a necessity for a school that prioritized stealth and the ability to strike from the shadows before vanishing back into them. Alchemy for a Viper wasn't just about surviving a transformation. It was a weapon to be used against the world. They were the premier experts in poisons and oils, developing concoctions that could paralyze a target or ensure a slow, agonizing death from a single scratch. This mastery of toxins extended beyond monster hunting. Because they were constantly underfunded and isolated, they became the first school to openly accept contracts against humans, earning them the title of Witcher Assassins. They operated in the political shadows of the South, where a poisoned blade was often more effective than an army. The relationship between a student and the school was defined by a specific, brutal tradition involving an animal bond. Every recruit was given a pet, usually a small animal, which they were required to care for and bond with throughout their training. On the day of their graduation, as a final test of their emotional detachment, they were ordered to kill that animal. This was meant to ensure that a Viper Witcher could sever any emotional connection at a moment's notice, making them the perfect tools for the high-stakes assassinations they were increasingly hired to perform. This lack of sentimentality made them incredibly effective, but deeply untrusted. Even within the Nilfgaardian Empire, where they were based, they were viewed as a necessary evil rather than honored protectors. They didn't care for the reputation of the profession. They cared about the results of their secret war against the Wild Hunt. Every human contract they took and every political figure they removed was a means to an end, providing the coin and influence needed to continue Ivar's mission of monitoring the spectral riders. Their fighting style, often referred to as the Dance of the Viper, was a blur of steel and venom. They didn't trade blows like the bears, or rely on the heavy signs of the griffins. A viper moved with a constant, predatory grace, looking for the one opening that would allow them to deliver a lethal dose of oil or a precision strike to a vital organ. They were the most efficient killers the Witcher schools ever produced, but that efficiency came at the cost of their soul. They had become exactly what they needed to be to fight ghosts, something that was no longer entirely human. The Vipers were also unique in their geographic focus. While most schools stayed within the northern kingdoms, the Vipers were firmly rooted in the south, deep within the heart of Nilfgaardian territory. This proximity to the Empire meant they were the first to feel the weight of imperial ambition. They learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the south, becoming as skilled in the language of court intrigue as they were in the language of the blade. It was a dangerous game to play, and it was one that would eventually lead to their ruin. The expansion of the Nilfgaardian Empire under the emperor known as the Usurper was the beginning of the end for the Viper School. The Usurper saw the Vipers not as a secret orders of monster hunters, but as a potential military asset that he didn't control. When the school refused to be conscripted into the Imperial Army as a specialized unit of assassins, the Usurper responded with the typical brutality of the Sun Banner. He sent his legions to the Tir Tochar Mountains, seized their fortress of Gortha Gvaed, and razed it to the ground. The destruction of their keep left the Vipers as a scattered, dying breed. They had no home, no laboratories, and no way to create new witches. For years, the survivors lived as outlaws and mercenaries on the fringes of the empire, until a new emperor, Emhyr var Emreis, saw a use for them. Emhyr approached Letho of Gulet with a deal that seemed like a salvation. If the Vipers would travel north and assassinate the kings of the northern kingdoms to destabilize the region for an invasion, Nilfgaard would rebuild their school and restore their legacy. Letho accepted the deal, believing it was the only way to save the Vipers from extinction. He and his brothers, Seret and Orkis, crossed the Yaruga and began a campaign of terror that changed the face of the north. They were responsible for the deaths of King Dimavend of Edon and King Foltest of Temeria, actions that plunged the northern kingdoms into the chaos that Emhyr required for his third war. They were efficient, silent, and successful, but they were also being played by a master of the game who had no intention of keeping his word. Once the northern kings were dead and the invasion had begun, Emhyr broke his promise. He had no interest in a rebuilt school of independent, highly trained assassins living within his borders. Instead of a new home, the Vipers received a death warrant. Nilfgaardian agents began hunting down the survivors of the very missions they had ordered, ensuring that no one would be left to tell the truth about the Emperor's involvement. The school hadn't just been destroyed. It had been used as a tool and then discarded like a broken blade. The tragedy of the Vipers is that they were undone by the very political shadows they thought they had mastered. They believed they could outmaneuver an emperor, forgetting that for men like Emhyr, Loyalty is a resource to be spent, not a bond to be honored. The Vipers had spent centuries preparing for a war against the Wild Hunt, only to be wiped out by a human war that they had helped facilitate. It was a bitter irony for a school that had always prided itself on seeing the bigger picture. By the time the Third Nilfgaardian War reached its height, the School of the Viper was effectively a memory. The few remaining members were either dead or in hiding, and the secrets of their poisons and their dual-blade combat were lost in the ruins of Gorthogvaed. They had become the ultimate example of what happens when a Witcher school abandons its neutrality. By picking a side, they had invited the destruction that finally claimed them, leaving nothing behind but the blood of kings and a legacy of betrayal. Letho of Gulet is the physical embodiment of the Viper School's final chapter. His massive, boulder-like frame often led people to mistake him for a simple brute, but beneath that muscle was a tactical mind that rivaled the best generals in the north. He was the primary antagonist of the second Witcher game, the Kingslayer, whose actions set the world on fire. Everything he did, every life he took, was driven by a single, desperate goal: the restoration of his school and the survival of his brothers. His arc across the games is a study in the weight of a dying legacy. In the second game, he is a force of nature, a shadow that Geralt is constantly chasing. He isn't a villain in the traditional sense. He is a man fulfilling a contract that he believes will save his people. He holds no personal malice toward the kings he kills, nor does he take pleasure in the chaos he causes. He is simply a viper doing what a viper does, striking the target that matters most to ensure the survival of the nest. By the time of the third game, Letho is a man who has lost everything. He knows that Emhyr betrayed him and that his brothers are dead. The school he fought so hard to save is officially defunct, and he is a ghost haunted by his own successes. If Geralt spares him in Loch Muin, Letho can be found hiding in Velen, and trying to erase his trail while Nilfgaardian bounty hunters close in. He is the last member of a school that had always operated outside the rules, and now he is the only one left to remember what those rules were. Letho's presence in the story serves as a mirror to Geralt's own journey. Both are mutants, both are outsiders, and both are caught in the middle of wars they didn't start. But where Geralt clings to a sense of personal morality and specific people, Letho chose to put his faith in an institution and a promise from a king. The result of that choice is his total isolation. He is a relic of a time when the Vipers thought they could change the world, and now he is just a man with diagrams of serrated blades and too much blood on his hands. His massive frame belies the speed and precision of his fighting style, which remains purely Viper in its execution. He still uses the poisons, the oils, and the twin blades that his school was known for. Even without a keep to return to, he carries the identity of his school in every movement he makes. He is a walking museum of a dead tradition, a reminder that the Vipers were the only ones who truly understood the threat of the hunt, even if they were ultimately destroyed by the world of men. The end of Letho's story, regardless of the player's choices, marks the end of the Viper School. Whether he dies in a dirty barn in Velen, or lives to see the end of the war, he is the last of his kind. There will be no new Vipers, no more secret wars against the hunt from Gorthogvaed. The legacy of Ivar Evil Eye ends with a man who was strong enough to kill kings, but not strong enough to save a dream. The Vipers vanished into the same shadows they once called home, leaving the world a little more chaotic and much less prepared for what was coming from the sky. The School of the Cat was born from a desire for improvement that quickly spiraled into corruption. It began in the early days of the Order, when a group of younger witches grew resentful of the mage's control and the rigid, nightly restrictions of the leadership at Morgraig. They believed they could refine the mutation process to produce better, more flexible witches. One night, they stole a significant amount of mutagenic compounds, alchemical tools, and experimental formulas and fled into the darkness, eventually settling at Stygia Citadel in the southern region of Ebbing. Their goal was to improve the trial of the grasses, specifically to allow for a greater emotional range and sensitivity. They felt that the traditional trials produced drones that were too stoic and detached from the world they were supposed to protect. However, they were witches, not mages, and their meddling with the delicate alchemical process had horrific consequences. Instead of refined sensitivity, the new mutations produced witches with heightened aggression, unstable psyches, and a tendency toward extreme cruelty. The cats that emerged from Steiger were faster and more agile than those from any other school, but they were also fundamentally broken. The process had backfired, stripping away the very moral compass they had hoped to enhance. In this instability defined the school from its inception, creating a generation of mutants who were as dangerous to their allies as they were to their enemies. They had traded stability for speed, and the result was a school that would become the most feared and hated on the continent. This origin story cemented the Cat's reputation as traitors to the Medallion. To the remaining members of the Order, and later the other schools, the Cats weren't just brothers who had left. They were thieves and heretics who had stolen the secrets of their craft and twisted them into something unrecognizable. This initial betrayal set the tone for centuries of hostility between the Cats and the rest of the Witcher community. They were the outcasts among outcasts, living in a citadel that was as much a laboratory for madness as it was a fortress for training. Stygia Citadel became a place of dark rumors and whispered horrors. It was said that the cat instructors were constantly experimenting on their students, pushing the limits of what the human body and mind could endure. The unstable nature of their mutations meant that many of their recruits didn't just die during the trials, they went insane. This produced a school culture where only the most ruthless and adaptable survived, further reinforcing the aggressive and unpredictable nature that the Cats were known for. Despite their instability, the Cats were undeniably effective. Their focus on precision over power made them lethal in a way that the more traditional schools struggled to match, though they were the first to truly weaponize the Witcher's agility, turning themselves into blurs of steel that could dismantle a target before it even knew a fight had begun. But this effectiveness came with a heavy price, as the Cats increasingly found themselves drawn to the lucrative world of contract killing, where their lack of emotional restraint was an asset rather than a liability. The School of the Cat was the only school that actively rejected the traditional boundaries of the Witcher profession. While other schools were exclusively male and primarily human, the Cats were willing to train anyone who could survive the trials, including women and non-human candidates, specifically elves. This inclusivity wasn't born out of a sense of equality, but a desperate need for recruits and a total disregard for the conventions of the world. If you were fast enough and ruthless enough, the Cats had a place for you. Their combat philosophy was a radical departure from the gold standard of the Wolf School. They prioritized light armor and maximum mobility, emphasizing agility and precision over power. A cat witcher didn't stand their ground. They danced around their enemies, looking for the one perfect strike that would end a fight instantly. This style required an incredible level of physical conditioning and a willingness to take risks that would make a bear or a wolf hesitate. They were the glass cannons of the Witcher world, unmatchable in speed but vulnerable if they ever stopped moving. Because they were shunned by the other schools and lacked the social standing of the Griffins, the cats leaned heavily into the mercenary trade. They were the only school that regularly accepted assassination contracts against humans and non-humans alike. They didn't care about neutrality or the lesser evil. They cared about the coin. This made them the most feared spies and killers for hire on the continent, as kings and nobles realized that a cat witcher wouldn't be stopped by a moral code or a sense of knightly honor. Their reputation was one of cold, calculating violence. Stories circulated of cat witchers who would fulfill a monster contract and then murder the villagers who had hired them if the payment was insufficient. This unpredictability made them pariahs, even among their own kind. A cat medallion was often seen as a mark of a murderer rather than a protector, and in many cities, a witcher from Stygia would be met with drawn steel the moment they were identified. They were the dark reflection of what a witcher could become when the connection to humanity was severed. The use of elven candidates was particularly significant. The Unsider, facing their own slow extinction and persecution by humans, found a strange kind of sanctuary in the cat school. Their natural agility and long lifespans made them exceptional candidates for the cat trials, and many of the school's most legendary members were of elven descent. This connection to the elder races only added to the suspicion and hatred directed toward the school by human authorities, further isolating the cats from the society they were supposedly meant to serve. Ultimately, what made the cats different was their total rejection of the witcher's role as a professional protector. They saw themselves as predators in a world full of prey, and they used their mutations to ensure they stayed at the top of the food chain. They were the first school to truly embrace the fact that they were no longer human, and they used that loss of humanity as a weapon. While other schools struggled to maintain a balance, the cats simply let go of the rope, falling into a darkness that they eventually made their own. The long-standing resentment between the schools reached its bloody climax in a plot that would change the history of the wolf school forever. Tries, the leader of the cat school at the time, was a man driven by a desperate need for political favor and a deep-seated jealousy of the wolves' noble reputation. He entered into a secret conspiracy with a Cadwinian mage named Astragaris and a local king who wanted to rid his lands of the Witcher freaks once and for all. The plan was a masterclass in deception. The cats helped organize a tournament at Kaer Morhen, under the guise of an event meant to bridge the gap between the schools and unite the remaining witchers. Many wolf witchers, believing in the possibility of reconciliation, arrived for the tournament and were encouraged to set aside their weapons for the festivities. It was a trap that the cats had helped facilitate, and when the signal was given, the tournament turned into a massacre. The cats and the king's soldiers fell upon the disarmed wolves with a ferocity that left no room for defense. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. The wolves, caught in their own home by men they had hoped to call brothers, were slaughtered in the very halls where they had trained. The cats used their superior speed to ensure that no one escaped, while the soldiers provided the numbers needed to overwhelm the few witchers who managed to find a blade. It was a betrayal of the medallion that would never be forgotten or forgiven. Tries had been promised that in exchange for his help in destroying the wolves, the cat school would be granted royal protection and a formal place in the kingdom's military. However, he had underestimated the depths of human prejudice. Once the wolves were dead and Kaer Morhen was a ruin, King Raduit issued a secondary order to kill all the witches present, including the cats who had just served him. The king had used the cats to eliminate one threat, and now he was using his own soldiers to eliminate the other. This double cross proved that Trice had been a fool, used and discarded by a human authority that saw all witches as equally monstrous. The cats who managed to survive the king's betrayal fled into the forests, but the damage was done. The tournament had effectively broken the back of the wolf school and cemented the cats' reputation as the ultimate traitors. It was a dark day for the profession, proving that the greatest threat to a witcher wasn't always a monster, but the ambition and jealousy of their own kind. The massacre at Kaer Morhen left a permanent scar on the witcher community. It ended any hope of unity and ensured that the remaining schools would look upon each other with nothing but suspicion for the rest of their existence. For the wolves, the name of the cat school became a curse, a reminder of the day their brothers became their murderers. For the cats, it was the moment they lost any remaining shred of honor, becoming the roaming outcasts that the world would eventually hunt to near extinction. The cat's tendency toward assassination and political meddling eventually brought a hammer down on their own home. Stygia Citadel, the southern fortress where the school had been founded, was eventually besieged and destroyed by a local army that had grown tired of the cats' interference and the constant threat they posed to the nobility. And unlike the collapse of the other schools, there was no sympathy for the cats when their walls fell. They had earned the world's hatred, and the world finally came to collect the debt. The fall of Stygia was a brutal affair, with the citadel being leveled to ensure that no trace of the school's alchemical labs or mutagenic records remained. Most of the cats inside were killed, but a small group managed to escape the slaughter. These survivors became the Dyn Marv Caravan, a traveling chapter of the cat school that refused to give up the life. They lived as outcasts on the road, taking their name from the Dead Sea of their origins and moving across the continent as a roaming group of murderous outcasts. The Dyn Marv Caravan lived as witches for hire in the darkest, most literal sense of the phrase. Without a fixed home, they became even more disconnected from the communities they moved through, often becoming as monstrous as the creatures they were supposedly hunting. They were known to pillage villages, take part in banditry, and accept any contract that offered a quick payout, regardless of the moral cost. They were the remnants of a school that had lost its way and decided to take the rest of the world down with it. The continued existence of the Dyn Marv Caravan on the road said a great deal about the cat school's core identity. They had always operated without a fixed home in their hearts, even when they had a citadel. Their agility and adaptability meant they could survive where other schools would have perished, but it was a survival without purpose. They moved through the world like a plague, a reminder of the instability and violence that the cat mutations had introduced into the world. Over time, the caravan itself began to splinter and fade. The constant pressure from local authorities and the hostility of other witches meant that every year there were fewer cats on the road. By the time of the games, a cat medallion is a rare and dangerous thing to possess. The few survivors are often solitary killers, like Gaetan, who struggle with the same heightened aggression and mental instability that destroyed their schools centuries earlier. The legacy of the cat school is one of wasted potential and bitter tragedy. They had started with a dream of improving the Witcher craft, but their pride and their lack of a moral anchor led them into a darkness that eventually consumed them. They left behind nothing but a reputation for betrayal and a series of ruins that serve as a warning to anyone who thinks they can rewrite the rules of the world without paying the price. The cats were the warning that every other school ignored until it was too late. When the original order collapsed at Morgraig, a senior witcher named Erland of Larvik decided that the dream shouldn't die with it. He watched as his brothers splintered into factions driven by violence and pragmatism, and he chose a different path. Erland gathered 13 like-minded companions and travelled north to Kovir, where they founded the Griffin school at the fortress of Caer Seren. His goal was simple but ambitious: to return to the noble, knightly values that the order was originally supposed to represent. Erland was a man of high principles, and he wanted the Griffins to be more than just monster hunters. He wanted them to be scholars of the Witcher world, men who were as well versed in etiquette, chivalry, and social conduct as they were in combat. Under his leadership, the Griffin school became the only one with a formal, written code of conduct that went beyond the basic contracts. They were taught that a witcher's social standing was a tool to be protected, as it allowed them to better serve as protectors of the weak. The Griffins were unique in their desire to be a respected part of society. While other witchers were content to live as freaks and outcasts, the Griffins cultivated relationships with kings and scholars. They understood that to truly protect the continent, they needed access to information and resources that only the upper classes possessed. This emphasis on social standing made them the most civilized of the schools, and for a long time, it granted them a level of safety and influence that no other witcher could match. This focus on knightly values wasn't just for show. It shaped every aspect of their training. A Griffin witcher was expected to be a gentleman on the road, treating even the poorest peasant with the same respect as a nobleman. They believed that by behaving with honor, they could slowly change the world's perception of their kind. It was a noble goal, but it also made them appear arrogant to the other schools, who saw the Griffins' chivalry as an empty performance by men who were still just mutants in the eyes of the law. Erland of Larvik himself lived to an incredible age, seeing his school flourish as a beacon of what a witcher could be. He personally oversaw the creation of the Great Library at Caer Seren, which became the most comprehensive repository of monster lore and magical theory on the continent. He believed that knowledge was the ultimate weapon against the darkness, and he dedicated his life to ensuring that his students were the most educated and prepared witchers in history. The School of the Griffin represented the last gasp of the Order's original idealism. For as long as it stood, it was a reminder that the witchers could have been more than just killers for hire. They could have been an order of knights, a scholarly brotherhood that defended civilization not just with steel, but with wisdom and honor. But in a world as dirty and political as the continent, such idealism was a dangerous thing to maintain, and it would eventually be the very thing that led to the Griffin's destruction. The Griffin school's approach to combat was built on the foundation of their scholarly nature. They were the only school that truly mastered the advanced use of signs, pushing the limits of what a witcher's minor sorcery could achieve. While a wolf or a cat might use a sign as a momentary distraction, a griffin built their entire strategy around them. They learned to channel their magical energy with a frequency and power that rivaled minor mages, in making them incredibly versatile and dangerous at both close and medium range. This mastery of signs was complemented by their unique sword-fighting style, known as the Nine-Sun style. It was a defensive, calculated approach that emphasized counterattacks and the strategic use of space. A Griffin Witcher didn't rush into a fight. They analyzed the situation, used their signs to control the environment, and waited for the perfect moment to strike with their medium-weight armor and balanced blades. It was a thinking man's combat style, reflecting the school's overall emphasis on intelligence over raw power. The heart of the Griffin School was the great library of Caer Seren. It contained magical knowledge and monster lore that no other school possessed, much of it donated by mages who were friendly to Erland's mission in the early days. This library made the Griffins the premier experts on the magical nature of the post-conjunction world. They understood the mechanics of chaos better than any other witches, and they used that knowledge to refine their signs and their alchemical preparations to a degree that others could only envy. This magical proficiency was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made them exceptionally effective against the most dangerous supernatural threats. On the other, it made the magical establishment, the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, increasingly nervous. The Griffins were becoming mages who could also fight with a sword, a combination of skills that many sorcerers found threatening to their own monopoly on power. For the very knowledge that made the Griffins successful was also painting a target on their backs. The Griffins' social standing and their library also made them a destination for travelers and scholars from across the north. Caer Seren was a place of learning as much as it was a training ground, and for a few centuries it was the intellectual center of the Witcher world. This era of prosperity was the high point of the Griffin legacy, proving that Erland's vision of a scholarly, respected order of witchers was possible. They were the scholars of the path, and their medallion was a symbol of wisdom as much as it was of strength. But the world outside Caer Seren was changing. The idealism of the early years was fading, and the tolerance for mutant mages was wearing thin. The Griffins focused on their books and their code. They were slow to realize that the social standing they had worked so hard to build was built on a foundation of sand. They believed that their honor and their knowledge would protect them, but they were about to learn that in a world ruled by fear and jealousy, being the smartest person in the room is often a death sentence. Part 17. The Avalanche and the End of the Griffins. The destruction of the Griffin School was a tragedy born from the very things that made them noble in the first place. They weren't just hunters. They were the scholars of the Witcher world, and their library at Caer Seren was the greatest repository of monster lore and magical theory on the continent. This knowledge didn't just make them effective, it made them a target for the magical establishment in Kovir. The local mages grew increasingly jealous of the school's private archives and the Griffin's mastery over signs, which allowed them to use magic with a frequency that rivaled the mages themselves. When the school's leadership refused to open their library to the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, the mages decided that if they couldn't possess that knowledge, they'd bury it forever. They didn't use an army or a mob to finish the school. They used the mountain itself. The mages triggered a massive artificial avalanche that swept down from the peaks above Caer Seren, obliterating the stronghold and everyone inside. It wasn't a fight. It was a sudden, cold erasure of centuries of wisdom and progress. Most of the school's witchers and students were lost instantly, buried under millions of tons of ice and stone along with the books they'd spent their lives protecting. The destruction was so complete that the Griffin legacy was effectively decapitated in a single afternoon, leaving the survivors to wander a world that had stolen their history. Imagine the silence that followed that avalanche. Caer Seren wasn't just a fortress. It was a center of learning, where the air was always thick with the smell of old parchment and the hum of magical energy. In an instant, all of that was replaced by the crushing weight of snow and the absolute stillness of a mountain grave. The mages who triggered the slide didn't even have to draw their swords. They just watched from the distance as the most principled school in existence was wiped off the map. They decided that a witcher with a book was more dangerous than a witcher with a blade, and they acted with a level of cruelty that even a monster would struggle to match. The loss of that library meant that the secrets of the Griffin signs and their unique alchemical preparations were gone. There was no one left to teach the younger generation how to channel chaos with such precision, and no one to explain the etiquette and chivalry that Erland of Larvik had made the cornerstone of their identity. The few survivors were those who happened to be away on the path, far from the reach of the mountain's collapse. One of these men was George of Kagan, a legendary figure whose deeds are still mentioned in old songs and whose tomb is a place of somber memory. But even a hero like George couldn't rebuild a school by himself. He died alone on the road, carrying the weight of a dead tradition that no one else was willing to understand. There was no one left to train new recruits or to recover the diagrams for their specialized armor. The mages got exactly what they wanted, and the world lost its most sophisticated line of defense against the supernatural. It proved that in the northern kingdoms, being right and being honorable wasn't enough to save you from the jealousy of the powerful. The library at Caer Seren remains a tomb, a cold reminder of what happens when a witcher school tries to be more than just a group of killers for hire. When you look at the ruins of that school today, you aren't just looking at stone and ice. You're looking at the end of a dream. Erland of Larvik wanted to prove that a mutant could be a gentleman and a scholar, but the world answered that dream with an avalanche. The Griffin medallion today is a rare sight, representing a legacy of wasted potential and a warning that the continent has a very low tolerance for anyone who masters the secrets of the world too well. The survivors didn't just lose their home, they lost their purpose. Without the library and the masters to guide them, the remaining Griffins became ghosts on the path, eventually fading into the same obscurity as the monsters they once studied. It's a bitter conclusion for the most noble branch of Alzur's creation, proving that sometimes the greatest threat to progress isn't a beast in the woods, but the fear in a human heart. The legacy left behind in the snow of Kavir is one of silence and rot. The diagrams for their medium armor, designed to balance protection with magical flow, are scattered across the north in the hands of people who don't even know what they're holding. The Griffins died as they lived, surrounded by the knowledge that no one else was willing to appreciate. They were the only school that truly tried to reconcile the witcher's nature with the values of civilization, and they were destroyed for it. Every time a traveler passes the ruins of Caer Seren, they're passing the grave of an ideal. The mountain didn't just bury the witches, it buried the idea that the continent could ever be a place where wisdom and mutation could live side by side. The School of the Wolf was the final major institution to emerge from the wreckage of the original order, and in many ways, it was the most resilient. While the bears and the cats had splintered off to pursue their own radical philosophies, the last remnants of the unified order travelled to the Morhan Valley in Cadwyn. They settled at Caer Morhen, the keep of the Elder Sea, a fortress tucked deep within a valley that was nearly impossible to reach without a guide. The founding of the Wolves wasn't just the creation of a new school. It was the final evolution of the original Witcher dream, tempered by the failures and the fractures of the schools that came before. They weren't looking to be the strongest or the most magical. They were looking for a balance that would allow them to survive a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to their kind. At Caer Morhen, the instructors decided on a balanced approach to the craft that didn't lean too heavily on one specialty. A wolf witcher was trained to be proficient in everything, from the most technical swordplay to the practical application of signs and alchemy. They didn't seek the raw power of the bear or the magical dependency of the Griffin. They sought a versatility that would allow them to survive any encounter on the path. This period is often called the Golden Age of the Wolves, a time when the school was a functioning, respected institution that produced the most reliable monster hunters on the continent. They took the lessons of the original order and stripped away the mage's control, creating a brotherhood that was defined by its autonomy and its commitment to the professional hunt. The school's early philosophy was one of quiet resilience and professionalism. They weren't interested in the political assassinations of the vipers or the emotional experiments of the cats. They focused on the work, maintaining a neutrality that was meant to keep them out of the wars between kings. Caer Morhen was a place where this neutrality was forged, a winter refuge where witchers could return to share their knowledge and mend their equipment. It was the only home many of them ever knew, a bond of brotherhood that was stronger than any national loyalty. The fortress sat at the edge of the world, overlooking a valley that felt like it belonged to another era, a place where the rules of men didn't apply, and the only thing that mattered was the strength of your steel and the clarity of your senses. Before the massacres changed everything, the Wolf School was the template that most people imagined when they thought of a witcher. They were the keepers of the most refined version of the Trial of the Grasses, and their instructors were among the most experienced in history. The Morhen Valley echoed with the sounds of boys training on the pendulum and mages working in the laboratories to stabilize the mutations. It was a time of growth and purpose, where the school was a beacon of what a witcher could be when they stayed true to the silver and the steel. They weren't trying to change the world. They were trying to make sure the world didn't change them. That sense of grounded identity is what allowed the Wolves to outlast almost every other school on the continent. The founding of the Wolf School was also a response to the loss of the Order's headquarters at Morgraig. By moving into the heart of Cadwyn, they put a massive amount of geography between themselves and the politics of the southern empires. They built a life that was centered on the path, where the only thing that mattered was the next contract. The Wolf Medallion became a symbol of that independence, a mark of a man who didn't serve a king or a mage, but the simple necessity of the hunt. They mastered a style that was fluid and adaptable, a way of fighting that mirrored the wolf's own predatory grace. It was a golden era for the profession, but like all golden eras on the continent, it was built on a foundation that the rest of the world was already starting to tear down. The halls of Caer Morhen in those early days were full of life, or at least the version of life a witcher is allowed to have. There were dozens of recruits in various stages of their training, learning how to track a beast through a forest and how to brew the oils that would keep them alive. The school wasn't just a training ground, it was a sanctuary. It was a place where a mutant could breathe without being called a freak, and where the weight of the path could be set aside for a few months of peace. That peace was the real legacy of the wolf school's beginning, a shared sense of belonging that would eventually be tested by the blood and fire of the 12th century. Part 19. What wolf school witchers were known. For a witcher carrying the wolf head medallion was known for a specific brand of reliability that other schools often lacked. They were the generalists of the profession, capable of handling a broad range of threats without needing a specialized team. A wolf was expected to be a master of the silver sword for monsters and the steel sword for men, though they famously refused to take contracts against humans. This distinction was a point of pride, a way to maintain their standing as professional protectors rather than common mercenaries. When you hired a wolf, you knew you were getting a man who followed a code, even if he didn't always talk about it. Their combat style was fluid and adaptable, designed to handle both the speed of a necrophage and the strength of a draconid. They utilized a series of footwork patterns that allowed them to move through a fight without ever staying in one place for too long. This balance extended to their use of signs, which were used as tactical tools to create openings rather than as primary weapons. A wolf witcher didn't just fight. They analyzed their opponent and used every tool in their arsenal to end the encounter with minimal risk. They were the ultimate practitioners of the lesser evil philosophy, trying to finish the job as efficiently as possible before moving on to the next contract. The Wolf School was also known for its rigorous secondary screening process called the Trial of the Forest. Before a student could even attempt the mutations, they had to navigate the dangerous terrain surrounding Kaer Morhen, often referred to simply as the Path. This ensured that only the most resilient and clever candidates were even considered for the Trial of the Grasses. It produced witchers who weren't just physically enhanced, but possessed a survival instinct that was second to none. They were the hunters who could survive for months in the wilderness with nothing but their blades and their knowledge of the land, a testament to the comprehensive nature of their training. Socially, the wolves were the most integrated of the schools, though they were still viewed as outcasts by many. They were the ones who most often worked the roads of the northern kingdoms, building a reputation for fairness and efficiency. A wolf medallion carried a certain weight, a sign that the wearer followed a code and could be trusted to finish a job. They were the gold standard of the trade, the school that defined the profession for the centuries following the conjunction of the spheres. People feared them, yes, but they also respected the fact that a wolf would actually do what he was paid for, without the hidden agendas of a cat or the political baggage of a viper. The versatility of the wolf style meant they were equally at home in the sewers of Vizima or the peaks of the Blue Mountains. They didn't rely on heavy armor to save them. They relied on their reflexes and their ability to read a situation before it turned lethal. This adaptability is why the wolves became the most iconic school in the eyes of the public. When a bard sang a song about a witcher, he was almost always singing about a man with a wolf on his chest. They were the face of the profession, carrying the burden of its reputation on their shoulders as they moved from one dirty contract to the next. What really set the wolves apart, though, was their sense of professionalism. They didn't take part in the assassinations of kings, and they didn't try to play God with their mutations. They accepted what they were and did the work that the world needed. That grounded approach gave them a stability that the more radical schools lacked. A wolf witcher was a man who knew his place in the world and didn't try to fight it. He was a protector of the people, even if the people didn't always want to be protected by a mutant. It was a lonely life, but it was one that the wolves performed with a level of dedication that earned them their place in history. Part 20. The Massacre at Kaer Morhen. The end of the Golden Age for the wolves came in the late 12th century during a massive, violent uprising. It was fueled by the pamphlet Monstrum, or a portrayal of witches, which spread fanatical lies about the mutations and the nature of the school. A mob of thousands of peasants, led and supported by mages who feared the school's independence, marched on the Morhen Valley. They didn't just want to kill the witches. They wanted to destroy the very idea of the school. They saw the fortress as a nest of abominations and believed that by burning it, they'd be doing the work of the gods. The defenders of Kaer Morhen were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and the magical fire that rained down on the keep. The attackers specifically targeted the mages who lived at the fortress and the Witcher instructors who were responsible for the training. They slaughtered everyone they could find, leaving the hallways and courtyards filled with the bodies of men and children. The massacre didn't just kill the current generation. It wiped out the laboratories and the knowledge needed to create new witches. The attackers were thorough, smashing the alchemical equipment and burning the formulas that had taken centuries to refine. Vesemir was the only witcher who survived the assault, mainly because he was a fencing instructor who wasn't involved in the alchemical side of the school. He was out on the path, or hidden during the worst of the slaughter, and he returned to find his home a ruin. He spent the next century trying to keep the keep standing, but he lacked the knowledge of the trial of the grasses. The massacre effectively ended the wolf school as a functioning entity, turning it into a tomb for a dead tradition. The air in Kaer Morhen never really cleared after that day. It always smelled of smoke and the memory of everything that had been lost. The loss of the laboratories was the most devastating blow. Without the specific formulas and the mages to stabilize the process, the wolves could no longer perform the mutations. This meant that the remaining witches were the last of their kind, walking a path that would eventually lead to the extinction of their school. The massacre proved that no matter how many monsters a witcher killed, the people of the continent would always find a reason to fear and hate the men who protected them. It was a betrayal of the social contract that had sustained the school for generations, a brutal reminder that the mutant is never truly safe among humans. The aftermath of the massacre left Kaer Morhen a shell. The walls remained, but the soul of the school was gone. Vesemir stayed behind to guard the ruins, a solitary figure in a fortress built for hundreds. He watched as the training grounds grew over with weeds and the laboratories filled with dust. Every winter, a few more witches would fail to return from the path, their medallions lost in some forgotten corner of the north. The school was dying a slow death, one man at a time. And there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The tragedy wasn't just the lives lost in the fire. It was the slow, agonizing silence that followed. This massacre redefined the wolf school's relationship with the rest of the world. They became even more isolated, even more suspicious of the mages and the common folk. They stopped trying to be anything other than survivors. The idealism of the early days was replaced by a grim acceptance of their fate. They knew the world was done with them, and they were just waiting for the final curtain to fall. Every time Geralt or Eskel returns to the keep, they're stepping into a graveyard, a place where the ghosts of their brothers are louder than the wind in the valley. It's a bitter legacy for the school that was once the gold standard of the profession. Part 21. The Last Wolves. Vesemir, Geralt, Lambert, Eskel, and what remains. By the time of The Witcher 3, the Wolf School is a shadow of its former self, consisting of just 4 men. Vesemir is the patriarch, the father figure who remembers the days before the blood and the fire. Geralt of Rivia is the most famous, a man whose destiny has pulled him into the middle of world-changing events. Lambert and Eskel represent the other survivors, each carrying the weight of the school in their own way. They are the last practitioners of the wolf style, returning to the ruins of Kaer Morhen every winter to escape the wars and the cold. They are the end of the line, the final few who still remember how to hold a sword the way the masters taught them. Their relationship is a complicated mixture of shared trauma and genuine brotherhood. They are men who were broken by the same process and spent decades alone on the path. But they find a sense of family in the crumbling halls of their home. They don't talk about the future because they know there isn't one for the wolves. They are the final witnesses to a 1,500-year history, carrying the memory of every brother who fell during the massacre and every student who didn't survive the grasses. There's a quiet understanding between them that doesn't need words. A look, a gesture, or a shared drink in the middle of a blizzard is all the connection they need. The defense of Kaer Morhen against the Wild Hunt is the final stand for the school. When Vesemir falls in that battle, the last link to the old order is broken. His death marks the end of the school's leadership and its connection to the past. He was the one who kept the keep together, the one who insisted on the winter gatherings, even when the numbers dwindled to almost nothing. After the battle, the remaining wolves decide to scatter, leaving the keep to the elements and the ghosts. There is no longer a school to return to, only the memory of what it meant to be a wolf. The gates are closed, and the Morhen Valley is left to the silence it has earned. What remains of the wolf school is not a place, but the legacy of the choices these men made. Geralt's pursuit of neutrality and his eventual decision to care about Ciri is the final chapter of the wolf philosophy. The school's history is a story of a world that needed a shield and then smashed it when it was no longer convenient. As the last wolves walk their final paths, they are the living proof that a Witcher is more than just a set of mutations. They are the conscience of a continent that has forgotten how to feel. They carry the lessons of Kaer Morhen with them. And though the school is dead, the spirit of the wolf continues to move through the world in the actions of the last few men who carry the medallion. Lambert and Eskel each take their own path, moving away from the keep and toward whatever lives they can find in a world that is rapidly changing. Lambert's bitterness and Eskel's quiet professionalism are two sides of the same coin, reflections of a school that was built on balance and destroyed by fear. They are the last of their kind, and they know it. There won't be any more wolves, no more boys running the pendulum or surviving the grasses. The story is over, and the last few pages are being written in the dust of the Morhen Valley. It's a somber end for the most legendary of the schools, but one that is performed with a level of dignity that the rest of the world never deserved. In the end, what the wolves left behind was a standard of excellence that will never be matched. They showed that even in a world as dark as the continent, it was possible to maintain a sense of honor and a commitment to a professional code. They protected the people who hated them, and they stood their ground when the world tried to tear them down. Kaer Morhen may be empty now, but the name of the wolf school still carries a weight that can make a king pause or a monster hesitate. They were the gold standard until the very end, and their legacy is written in the blood of the monsters they killed and the children they tried to save. Section 7. The Decline of All the Schools, Part 22. Why the Monsters Stopped Coming. The decline of the witcher profession was caused by a simple, unavoidable fact. The witchers were too good at their jobs. By the 13th century, the monster population that had arrived during the conjunction of the spheres had been significantly thinned out. Species like forktails, slizzards, and even the common drowner were becoming rare in civilized areas. This was exactly what Alzur and the first mages had intended, but it left the witchers without a primary reason to exist. They had solved the problem they were created to handle, and in doing so, they'd rendered themselves obsolete. It was a slow-motion victory that felt a lot like a defeat. The shrinking monster population meant that there were fewer and fewer contracts available on the path. Witchers who had once been in high demand now had to compete for scraps, leading to the friction between the schools that often turned violent. In many parts of the northern kingdoms, a village could go years without seeing a monster that required a professional hunter. This led to a dramatic drop in the coin that flowed into the schools, making it impossible to maintain the keeps or fund the expensive alchemical trials. The financial foundation of the profession crumbled as the world became safer for humans, and the witchers were the last ones to realize the party was over. The ecology of the continent was shifting as humans expanded and tamed the wilderness. The problems that people faced were now mostly caused by other humans, wars, plagues, and taxes, rather than ghouls in the graveyards. A silver sword wasn't the solution to a Nilfgaardian invasion or a Redanian purge. The witchers had essentially hunted themselves out of a career, leaving them as relics of a bloodier era that the world was trying to put behind it. It's a paradox that defines the witchers' existence. The more successful they were, the closer they got to their own extinction. They were the architects of a world that no longer had a place for them. This decline was gradual but final. Every successful hunt was another step toward the end of the profession. The world didn't need thousands of mutants anymore. It only needed a handful of contractors to handle the stragglers. The schools, which were designed to produce an army of monster hunters, were now bloated institutions without a war to fight. It was a slow extinction, driven not by a monster's claws, but by the quiet success of a job well done. The path grew longer and lonelier with every passing year, until the sight of a witcher in a village became more of a curiosity than a necessity. The age of monsters was ending, and the age of the mutant was ending right along with it. You can see the results of this decline in every empty tavern and every unpaid contract Geralt encounters. The common folk no longer see the witcher as a savior. They see him as a remnant of a darker time that they'd rather not remember. The fear that once kept them safe has turned into a resentment that makes every interaction a struggle. The world has moved on to new problems, and the witcher is left holding a sword that no one wants to pay for. It's a bitter pill to swallow for a man who was literally built for a single purpose, only to find that purpose is no longer required. The decline wasn't just about the number of monsters. It was about the world's willingness to tolerate the mutant in its midst once the utility was gone. The legacy of this success is a world that is safer but much less understanding. The witchers cleaned the continent, and then the continent threw them away. It's a cycle that has repeated itself with every school and every generation. By the time the Third War with Nilfgaard begins, the Witcher is a rare sight, a relic of a time when the wilderness was still dangerous and the rules were still being written. The schools are gone, the keeps are ruins, and the few remaining witchers are just waiting for the last monster to fall so they can finally rest. It's the ultimate irony. The Witcher's greatest success was also his final failure. Part 23: Anti-Witcher Sentiment and the Politics of Fear. As the threat of monsters faded, the focus of the public's fear shifted to the Witchers themselves. People had always been suspicious of the mutant freaks, but when the monsters were outside the door, that fear was balanced by necessity. Without the immediate danger of a griffin or a werewolf, the common folk only saw the yellow eyes and the cold detachment of the man holding the sword. They saw someone who was faster, stronger, and more dangerous than they could ever be, and they grew to resent it. They forgot the lives saved and only remembered the mutations and the cost of the contract. The gratitude of a village lasts exactly as long as the fear of the beast, and once the beast is dead, the Witcher is just a freak in the town square. This resentment was weaponized by religious and political leaders who needed a scapegoat for the world's problems. The Eternal Fire and other fanatical groups preached that witches were soulless abominations that went against the natural order. Kings who had once paid for protection now saw the schools as independent, unpredictable forces that couldn't be taxed or controlled. The resulting pogroms and massacres, like the one at Kaer Morhen, were the inevitable result of a society that no longer felt it needed its protectors. It's easier to burn a fortress than to admit you still need the mutants inside it, and the politics of fear provided the perfect excuse to do just that. The politics of fear proved to be more lethal than any monster a Witcher had ever faced. It turned neighbors into mobs and kings into executioners. The schools were burned not because they were failing, but because they were no longer convenient. By the time of Geralt's journey, the word Witcher is often used as a curse, and a man walking into a tavern with a medallion is met with spat-out insults and refusal of service. The world has decided that it would rather live with a few monsters than with the mutants who kill them. This coordinated effort to erase the Witchers was fueled by the same ambition and jealousy that destroyed the Griffins. A reminder that the human heart can be just as cold as a mountain peak. This sentiment trickled down into every layer of society, making the life of a Witcher increasingly difficult. Contracts were harder to find, and payments were often withheld or contested by villagers who no longer respected the trade. The Witchers became the target of every superstition and every failure of the northern kingdoms. If a crop failed or a child got sick, it was easy to blame the mutant who had passed through the village the week before. It was a slow-motion genocide, driven by the very people the Witchers had bled to protect for 15 centuries. They were the convenient villain in a world that was looking for someone to hate, and they played the role with a grim stoicism that only made people hate them more. The anti-Witcher sentiment was also a tool of political consolidation. By clearing out the Witcher schools, kings and emperors removed a group of warriors that didn't swear fealty to any crown. The Witchers were a neutral party in a world that demanded everyone pick a side. Their refusal to join the wars of men made them a target for both sides, as neither king could trust a man who only worked for coin and a code. The destruction of the keeps was a way to bring the continent under total control, ensuring that the only people with the power to fight were the ones who followed the royal banner. The Witchers' neutrality, which was meant to be their shield, ended up being the very thing that made them defenseless. When you see a pogrom in the streets of Novigrad, or the ruins of a school in the mountains, you're seeing the result of centuries of built-up resentment. It's the final stage of the Witcher's decline, a transition from being a necessary evil to being just plain evil. The world has made up its mind about what a Witcher is, and no amount of monster hunting is going to change it. They are the leftovers of a forgotten era, and the world is in a hurry to clean up the mess. The politics of fear have succeeded where the monsters failed, breaking the back of a profession that once stood as the only thing between humanity and the dark. Part 24. No new witches. The loss of the trial. The most permanent consequence of the decline was the destruction of the knowledge needed to create new witches. The trial of the grasses was never a simple physical process. It was a complex alchemical and magical procedure that required precise measurements and the constant presence of a master mage. When the schools were sacked, the attackers prioritized the laboratories and the mages who lived there. They burned the formulas, smashed the equipment, and killed the only people who understood how to stabilize the mutations. They knew that if they didn't cut off the source, the witches would eventually return. By destroying the labs, they ensured that the current generation would be the last. Without the labs at Kaer Morhen, Stiga Citadel, or Gorta Gvaed, the schools became dead-end institutions. The remaining witches were fighters and trackers, not alchemists or mages. They could teach a boy how to hold a sword, but they couldn't rewrite his biology. This means that the current generation of witches is the final one, a group of aging men walking toward an inevitable extinction. Every time a witcher falls on the path, the profession gets one step closer to vanishing forever. There are no more recruits, no more children surviving the grasses, and no more medallions being handed out to new graduates. The story is winding down, and there's no one left to start a new chapter. As seen in The Witcher 3, attempting the trial without a master mage is nearly impossible and carries a near-total mortality rate. The process is too volatile and too dangerous to be performed by amateurs or with incomplete information. The mages and the mobs who destroyed the keeps knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't have to kill every witcher. They only had to make sure no more were ever made. It was a biological erasure that has effectively ended the history of the mutants on the continent. When Geralt tries to help Uma, he has to use the last remnants of the alchemical labs, and even then, it's a desperate gamble that barely succeeds. It's a stark reminder that the power to create a witcher is gone. The loss of the trial represents the final victory for those who feared the witches. It ensures that the problem of the mutants will solve itself within a single lifetime. The world has moved into a new era where magic is controlled by the Lodge, and monsters are becoming myths once again. The remaining witches are the last ghosts of a world that is moving on without them, carrying the secrets of their own creation to their graves. The path has reached its end, and there is no one left to take up the silver sword. It's a quiet, slow-motion tragedy that no amount of heroism can prevent. The labs are cold, the mutagens are gone, and the future of the witches is as empty as the halls of Kaer Morhen. Even if someone wanted to rebuild the schools, the cost would be astronomical, and the social opposition would be total. No king is going to fund the creation of a new army of mutants, and no mage is going to risk their standing to help them. The knowledge isn't just lost, it's being actively suppressed. The mages who survived the massacres have no interest in sharing their secrets with the men they helped destroy. The trial of the grasses has become a forbidden art, a relic of a time when the world was desperate enough to try anything to survive. Now that the desperation is gone, the world would rather forget that such a thing was ever possible. The silence in the laboratories is the final verdict on the witch's history. It's a silence that speaks of lost potential, and a world that chose a safer, more predictable future over the one the witches offered. The last few mutants are just wandering the road, waiting for the clock to run out. They are the final evidence of a failed experiment, a group of men who were created for a world that no longer exists. When the last wolf and the last cat finally fall, the secret of the grasses will be truly lost, and the continent will finally be a place where only humans and their own monsters remain. Part 24. What the schools left behind. The legacy of the Witcher schools is one of bitter sacrifice, and a world that was saved by the very people it hated. They were a temporary solution to a cosmic disaster, a group of men who were broken to mend a broken world. What they left behind is not a set of functioning institutions, but a body of knowledge, a unique philosophy of neutrality, and a reputation for endurance that survived for 15 centuries. So they proved that humanity would go to the most horrific lengths to create monsters to fight monsters, and then kill the protectors once the job was done. It's a legacy that is written in the blood of every drowner and every griffin that no longer threatens the roads. The remaining witchers are relics, living reminders of a time when the world was scarier, but the distinction between hero and beast was far more clear. They carry the memory of every school, the nightly griffins, the cold bears, the silent vipers, and the balanced wolves, not as an organization, but as a personal testament to what it meant to be a witcher. These traditions gave them a framework for surviving in a world that never wanted them to exist, and they clung to that framework until the very end. They are the keepers of a forgotten code, the last men who still believe that a contract is a sacred thing and that a mutant can have a moral position worth listening to. What survives is the individual. The lessons learned in the keeps and on the path are still being applied by men like Geralt as they handle the last few threats on the road. The spirit of the Witcher remains in the choices they make, the code they follow, and the silver and steel they carry. They were the architects of a safer, more human world, even if that world no longer has a place for them. The ruins of their fortresses are monuments to a brotherhood that survived against all odds for centuries after the massacres. They left behind a blueprint for how to live in a world that hates you, a way of staying true to yourself when everything around you is trying to turn you into a monster. The wolf head medallion is more than just a tool. It's a symbol of a struggle to stay human when everything around you is trying to turn you into a beast. That is the true legacy of the Witcher schools. They showed that even a mutant could have a heart worth protecting and a conscience worth listening to. They were the only ones who saw the world for what it really was, a place of grey choices and hard consequences. And they lived in that greyness with a level of dignity that few humans could manage. As the last Witcher walks his final path, he carries the weight of a dying trade, a relic of a time when the world was a little more magical and a lot less certain. The schools also left behind a body of martial and alchemical knowledge that continues to circulate in the shadows of the continent. The diagrams for their armor and the recipes for their oils are still out there, hidden in forgotten chests and ruined keeps. This knowledge is a testament to the ingenuity and the resilience of the men who created it, a reminder that they weren't just soldiers, but masters of a craft that was as much an art as it was a science. This legacy may be fragmented and decaying, but it's still the only thing that works when a real monster comes calling. It's a final, ironic gift to a world that tried so hard to forget them. In the end, the story of the Witcher schools is the story of humanity's complicated relationship with its own survival. We create what we need to stay alive, and then we destroy it because it reminds us of how afraid we were. The witches were the physical embodiment of that fear and that survival instinct. She and their disappearance is a sign that the continent is moving into a new, more confident and perhaps more dangerous era. They did the work that no one else would touch, and they paid for it with their humanity. That is what the schools left behind. A world that is safer for humans, and a memory of the mutants who made it that way.